Hi, I'm Stephanie, teaching for DTN 240, Introduction to Nutrition. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at global nutrition and malnutrition. Our learning objectives for today include discussing the extent of food insecurity in the U.S. and contributing factors, and also exploring causes of malnutrition worldwide. We're going to identify populations that are at the greatest risk for malnutrition and also explain several ways to reduce hunger. We'll also describe some of the health consequences of undernutrition specifically, and we'll touch on overnutrition a little bit as well. So taking a look at even just this infographic, and there's no need to memorize these numbers. They do change from year to year, and as you can see, these are from 2022. I do want to point out, though, that this first statistic is referencing hunger, chronic undernutrition. The second statistic is referencing food insecurity, and those bring up an important point about a couple of different terms I would like to sort of define before we move into our discussion on world hunger and malnutrition. And those are food insecurity and malnutrition. So let's take a look at food insecurity first. All right, in this slide, you see this little graphic that shows basically the different levels of food insecurity. So we start here with high food security. What does this mean? This means that within a household, the individuals within the household did not have any problems accessing food, eating food, things like that. So they had high food security. Then we move down a level to marginal food security. In this case, households had problems or anxiety at times about accessing adequate food, but generally they were still able to consume the amounts of food that they needed in order to achieve healthy outcomes. Once we get to low food security, though, that's when we see that households are reducing the quality, variety, and desirability of their diets. Their quantity of food intake are not substantially disrupted. So they might be disrupted somewhat or to some degree. They might eat less than what they would like or may not have access to foods that are quite as nutritious that they would like. But for the most part, they're still able to have access to some level of food. With very low food security, there are times during the year where eating patterns of one or more of the household members were disrupted and food intake was reduced because the household lacked money or other resources for food. Now let's take a look at malnutrition. We see two basic types. So undernutrition is when we're not eating enough macronutrients, so things like calories, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And we also might be missing some of the micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. Overnutrition is a different type of malnutrition that we don't often think of, and that's where we're getting maybe too many macronutrients, so calories, carbohydrates, or protein or fat. And then the micronutrients can vary. Sometimes it means that we see imbalances, like, for example, there are some minerals we might be getting too much of, maybe too much sodium that leads to adverse health outcomes. But then there are some that we may not be getting enough of. So if I have a high intake of soda, for example, I'm getting a lot of carbohydrates. I'm overnourished in that sense. But because my sweet tooth is satisfied, I may not be reaching for as much fruit, which might lead to a vitamin C deficiency. So those micronutrients can vary with overnutrition. So we start to see that with food insecurity, we don't have access or availability to as much food, whereas malnutrition is more related to the amount of food that we are actually taking in. This next chart is going to really show side by side the difference between the two. So with food insecurity, at its basic level, what is it? It's not having enough food regularly. Whereas with malnutrition, it's not getting the right amount or types of nutrients whenever I am eating. The main cause of each of these, for food insecurity, it's lack of availability or access to food. So either food is not available in my community, or even if food is available to my community, my access might be limited. Either that's a financial issue, right? I don't have enough money to purchase the food that is available, or maybe a transportation issue. I can't get to the market to purchase the food. With malnutrition, availability and access can still really play a role in that, but there's also this additional component of education that might lead to a poor diet or health issues that are affecting your nutrition intake. Who is affected by each of these? Anyone can be affected by either food insecurity or malnutrition. Typically, we see more food insecurity issues in countries that are more developed. So, countries like the United States tend to experience more food insecurity, whereas malnutrition tends to occur more frequently in developing countries. So, countries that are still kind of working on infrastructure and things like that. However, it is important to note we still see malnutrition in the United States, and we still see food insecurity in those developing countries as well. So, what are some results of food insecurity and malnutrition? For food insecurity, primary result is hunger. I don't have enough availability or accessibility to food, so I'm hungry. It can also lead to skipping meals, or in some households, an adult will often withhold the amount of food that they are eating so that the children have enough food to eat. It also leads to an increased amount of worry or anxiety around food, and food insecurity over a long term can eventually lead to malnutrition, both types. So food insecurity can lead to undernutrition, but food insecurity can also lead to overnutrition. With malnutrition, I'm going to see things like weight loss, because lack of access to food over time. I'm going to see stunted physical and mental development. And this is particularly something we don't want to see when it comes to children. Childhood is a period of great growth and development, not just in the body, but also in the brain. So anytime we're not giving our bodies the food that it needs, we're going to see some stunted growth and development. And in the case of children, sometimes that growth cannot be made up later. Our brains are rapidly developing and they really need that nutrition. Some nutrient deficiencies of note. Vitamin A deficiency is the leading cause of blindness in the world, so that's an important one. Another one is iron deficiency. This is actually the most common micronutrient deficiency in the world, and that can lead to, of course, iron deficiency anemia, but also a host of other symptoms like low energy and things like that. Let's see, what else do we have here on this list? Lowered immune system. So if we are malnourished and we are exposed to some type of virus or bacterial infection or anything like that, our bodies have lower defense systems to be able to fight that off. And then this funny word here, kwashiorkor, that's something we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. But we have our food insecurity and we have malnutrition. And then malnutrition can be divided up, remember, into undernutrition and overnutrition. And then now within undernutrition, we have two categories. One of those is marasmus and the other one is kwashiorkor. With marasmus, we see an overall deficiency of calories and protein. This can occur in children or adults. It's basically starvation over time. So I'm not eating enough calories, not eating enough protein, not eating enough carbs. I'm just not eating enough over time. So I start to experience muscle wasting and fat wasting and have this severely thin, emaciated appearance. So you see this little girl on the bottom left, and you can see her muscle tissue, her fat tissue is just wasted away so that we see skin, we see bones. That is marasmus. Kwashiorkor is a little bit different. With kwashiorkor, we might still be getting enough calories for growth and development, but those calories don't contain enough protein. So we're getting enough carbs. We may or may not be getting enough fat, but we're not getting enough protein. This one is more common in children, especially in regions where diets are primarily made up of grain product. So what this leads to is that similar muscle wasting in the arms and legs. So we see really thin arms like on this little boy on the right, but the belly can be really swollen. So a misconception is that the belly is large because the child is getting enough to eat. The belly is actually large because of edema or fluid collection in the stomach that happens in that torso area as a result of the protein deficiency. So really important to be able to distinguish between the two, marasmus and kwashiorkor. Okay, so now we've talked about the difference between food insecurity and malnutrition, kind of what those differences are, where we're more likely to see them. We talked a little bit about how food insecurity is more common in developed countries like the US. So here is just kind of a snapshot of what we're looking at in the US. About 13.5% of US households were food insecure or had low or very low food security. So those were that bottom two layers on that triangle that I showed you that shows the different levels of food insecurity. About 13.5% of households are in the bottom two categories. That is equal to about 18 million households or just over 47 million people. The state level prevalence of food insecurity, I have put this graphic from the USDA on the right-hand side so that you really can get an idea that a lot of times this food insecurity is happening the most often in states that are more southern. So food insecurity is most common in states in the South. So these more bright orange or red toned. In this chart for data for 2021 to 2023, the most recent data we have Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, and South Carolina having food insecurity above the U.S. average. Missouri, where our university is located, we have food insecurity that's near the U.S. average, and then a lot of those states in the north have food insecurity below the U.S. average. So let's zoom out and talk about what malnutrition looks like around the world. This is Hunger Map 2025, and just like we see how food insecurity is really concentrated in the southern parts of the US, we also see that malnutrition has that same tendency to be really concentrated in certain parts of the world. Most of them that we see that are really high rates, so 40% or above, are going to be in that middle section of the continent of Africa. There's a lot of 10 to 25% as well in the region of Africa and then some of those South Asian countries. We do see some moderate malnutrition also in South America and Latin America. So that is a snapshot of malnutrition around the world. Let's talk a little bit about the drivers of world hunger and malnutrition. So we can see that food insecurity, malnutrition, these things happen. We see that the consequences are not great for our overall health. But why do we have these things? I wanted to take a minute to really parse out the terms that we talked about just a few minutes ago, the availability versus accessibility, and then add another component to that on education. On food availability, I think the most important takeaway that's kind of shocking for people is to know that we actually make enough food to feed everyone in the entire world. So the current global food production exceeds the needs of the world population. So the food is available. The question then is it accessible? Is the food going where it needs to go to feed the people that it needs to feed? So that's an accessibility issue. And accessibility of food is this idea of the term food deserts. Food deserts are areas that lack grocery stores, farmers markets, and other sources of healthy food. So these can happen a lot in the US, especially because it's considered a food desert if you live in an urban area and you live less than 1 mile from a grocery store that serves a variety of healthy and nutritious foods. So you can probably think of communities in your city where the closest available place to buy food would be like a gas station. So you might be able to get a hot dog or a candy bar or something like that there, but it's not the same thing as having a fully serviced grocery store within that mile. In rural areas, they extend it out a little farther. The definition of a food desert is living outside of a 10-mile radius of a grocery store. So be familiar with that term, food deserts. And then that last piece is the education piece. We need to have some level of food and health literacy to know what types of food to eat to prevent malnutrition, but also some education on understanding what tools are available if we don't have the funds in order to purchase food. Do we have the knowledge or the education to be able to know where to go for the resources to help us get it? So that's really kind of a three-pronged approach. There have been identified 5 major drivers of world hunger by the United Nations World Food Program. Those 5 can be divided up into more environmental drivers and then social drivers. The environmental drivers are things like climate events and how those impact not only communities, but also agriculture. So when you think about any type of major climate event, like a tsunami or a hurricane, here in the Midwest, we have tornadoes. Not only do these things sweep through communities, but also the physical fields of foods that can be just destroyed from flooding or droughts or this wind damage, all these types of things. So that's a really important consideration. Another thing that is considered an environmental driver is food waste. So we have this really interesting paradox where we have millions of people who are hungry and don't have enough food to eat, and yet almost a third of all of the food that we grow is wasted. And that happens at all different levels of the chain. So we might leave some in the field when we're harvesting, right? Or maybe we're processing some and then some food gets lost in the ways of processing. But then we get it, to the grocery store and the expiration date passes, so it goes in the dumpster. Then it gets home, right? And I don't know about you, but I have definitely had food waste before. So food waste occurs at all points in the food chain. The last 3 drivers are considered more social drivers. One of those is conflict. So we don't necessarily see this as much in the US, but whenever you go to countries that have a lot of internal fighting, so civil wars, a lot of instability, there's also more, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, all kinds of conflicts happening in the world. All of these impact the accessibility and availability of food. Again, through crop destruction, field destruction when that conflict is happening on the land, but also in the sense of accessibility, transportation, the flow of food kind of through the food system. Another one is inequalities. It's very common, especially in other countries, for women and children to have disproportionate levels of malnutrition because of their access to food. Birth order can matter. In some cultural traditions, the firstborn children, especially firstborn males, are considered a higher priority for health and wellness. Another social driver is poverty. I listed this one last because typically that's the first thing we think of when we think someone is experiencing food insecurity or experiencing hunger. It's because they don't have enough money to purchase food. And that can certainly be the case, but I wanted us to explore some of these other drivers before jumping right to that one. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take a look at who is affected by these different things, by food insecurity and malnutrition. For food insecurity, we're going to see that among single householders. So this can be individuals who live by themselves. It's also disproportionately women. More than a third of single householders are moms with children. And so the idea behind both is the same. It's that we have this single income that is expected to cover all household expenses. And in the case of households with children, that those expenses include feeding more than one person. So that is a risk factor for food insecurity. Our household income below poverty line is also going to be a risk factor for food insecurity. One thing I want to note here with household income below poverty line is a lot of people have a misconception that if you have food insecurity, it's because you're not working hard or you are lazy. But I just want to point out that you can work a full-time job and still have an income below the poverty line. So that can happen whenever pay rates are low, or maybe the pay rate is good, but you have expenses that are a little bit too high. They exceed what you're able to pay. And that can happen because housing costs go up. That can happen whenever we have healthcare emergencies and medical bills and things like that. So a lot of things about income can influence your food security status. Malnutrition has a couple of different people groups that are affected depending on where you're looking at malnutrition. If you're looking globally at just world hunger, malnutrition in general, we're going to see children and women being impacted the most, especially women who are pregnant or lactating because their needs are higher. So they're more likely to experience malnutrition. If you're looking domestically in the US, older adults are going to be our biggest population that's struggling with malnutrition. Some factors that you might consider when thinking about why older adults in the US are more likely to experience malnutrition are issues related to mobility. So that can affect transportation to get to a grocery store to purchase food, but it can also affect your ability to prepare the food inside the home. Income tends to go down as you get older and retire. Loneliness is also a factor. So a lot of times in those later years of life, we are losing people we love and people maybe that we've lived with for a long time and eaten with, and now we're dealing with loss and grief and depression, and those can really impact the desire to eat and to prepare food as well. Another population that I did not put on this slide, but I want to point out, are people with mental illnesses. These can really affect an ability to purchase food, to prepare food, all of those types of things. So that can have an effect. All right, let's switch on a more positive note. So those are some big facts and figures. Who is working on solving these problems? We have lots of different groups of people who are interested in alleviating world hunger. And so here are kind of three major ones broken down. So first we have our governing agencies. So that includes our own government, right, and policies within the US, but also this incredible organization called the United Nations, which is a bunch of different countries come together, headquartered in New York, to develop programs and policies to help alleviate hunger. So the United Nations have developed something called the Sustainable Development Goals, and goal number 2 is in fact zero hunger. So they're trying to help us all work toward alleviating hunger in the United States and across the entire world. There's also some other organizations that are housed within the United Nations that you might be familiar with. One is Food and Agriculture Organization. That's FAO. WFP is World Food Program. WHO is the World Health Organization. And then UNICEF works specifically with children. One thing that these organizations do, especially UNICEF and the World Food Program, is they provide ready-to-use therapeutic feeding, which are these kind of little pouches of something that's kind of like a peanut paste, very nutrient dense, that we provide for people who are experiencing acute malnutrition. They also provide oral rehydration therapy, which would be, say, there's a community that has unsafe water, and so there's a lot of dehydration happening, or diseases or illnesses that cause a lot of diarrhea. So there's a lot of dehydration happening. That can really severely impact your health outcomes. And so they provide oral rehydration therapy, which is basically a safe water supply, but also contains minerals, carbohydrates, things like that to really rehydrate people. Those acronyms are RUTF for ready-to-use tube feeding, ready-to-use therapeutic feeding. The ones we just talked about are like government associated, whether the US or other governments in other countries. NGOs are non-governmental organizations, so they are nonprofit, they are charitable, they can be religious, but they don't have to be. Some examples of these are Convoy of Hope, Salvation Army, etc. And so they provide intervention as well, either in the form of food relief or education, support for infrastructure and communities. So those are some different examples of NGOs. We also have private organizations or private companies that give back. So there is a concept called corporate social responsibility, or CSR, which you don't have to know about for this class, but it basically is the idea that we like it, right? When our companies give some of their profits back to make our community stronger. And so some examples of that is the Walmart Foundation, for example, here in this image, partnered with the Salvation Army in order to provide some relief within a community after disaster. Some areas of opportunity that we have for improving world hunger in general, it starts with food policy. That's really starting from the top down. So really making sure that our food policies support the health and nutrition for individuals. Biotechnology and development refers to some of the things we talked about in our chapter 20 lecture. So things like how do we produce crops that are more resilient to things like pests and climate events and things like that. Improved water safety and agricultural practices are very important for protecting land health and also protecting people health. Food fortification programs are really important. So anytime we can add nutrition to foods that people like to eat, that is a benefit. So we talked about iron being the most common deficiency in the world. When I was a kid, there was a really popular bread called Iron Kids bread, where they fortified the white bread with iron, because kids love white bread, and so then kids were able to eat more iron. We also fortify milk with vitamin D. There's probably lots of examples you can think of where we have fortified foods. Salt, iodized salt, is fortified with iodine in order to prevent goiter. So food fortification programs are really important for preventing malnutrition. I also want to stress the importance of education and literacy, especially when it comes to inequalities with women and children. Providing education and literacy is a huge step toward preventing future food insecurity in a household and malnutrition. And then finally, hunger relief. And this picture at the bottom, that's an example of that ready-to-use therapeutic feeding. The last thing we're going to look at is hunger relief in the United States. So those things that I just talked about are kind of bigger picture across the world. That's what we can do to help alleviate world hunger. In the US specifically, we do have some policies, which we'll talk about in a minute, but our main way outside of policy for helping support people with food insecurity is through this pathway of food, surplus food, in order to be able to donate to individuals. So we'll start at the top with, I'm using Feeding America here as the example because it is the largest organization that does this. They collect donations in order to be able to purchase and acquire surplus food. Feeding America then distributes that food to food banks all across the country. Our food bank in Springfield, Missouri is Ozarks Food Harvest. So it's not a place that individuals go to get food from. It is just sort of like a bank of food. So think of it like a vault, right? That's where all the excess food from Feeding America goes. Then your local food bank, in our case, Ozarks Food Harvest, will distribute that food to local food pantries. So some examples of that would be on campus. We have Bear Pantry. They get some of their foods from Ozarks Food Harvest. We have Crosslines is a food pantry also in the area. So the food pantries get their food from the food bank. Finally, the individuals get the food from the food pantry. So that's where then the household has the food that they need, that they obtained from food pantries. The food pantries got that food from food banks. The food banks get their resources from Feeding America. So make sure that you understand each one of these and kind of the role that each plays in addressing food insecurity. Let's finish up by talking a little bit about our policy or government assistance programs. There are a few that I really want you to be familiar with for the purpose of this class. So the first one you've probably heard of, it's called SNAP. It was formerly the food stamps program. Eligibility for this one is low-income households that meet eligibility guidelines. And the cool thing about this one is that if you meet those low-income guidelines, you basically get a debit card that you can then take to the grocery store and use like any other debit card. So there are some guidelines on what you can and can't purchase. You can't purchase alcoholic beverages or things like that with the SNAP program, but it's a great way to supplement, intended to supplement any resources that you may already have to get food. Another one to look at is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. This one's more commonly known as WIC. This is also for low-income population, but they specifically want to assist pregnant women, lactating women, infants, and children. So women, infants, and children is who we help with this one. The Child and Adult Care Food Program is another interesting one that some people don't know about. This one is also for low income, the population that they really want to help support are children and senior adults who receive care outside the home. So the daycare or the senior adult care organization receives funds to purchase food to then be able to prepare and serve for the people in its care. So those are 3 of them to be familiar with, but certainly take a look at all of these. This topic is endlessly fascinating to me. We have a whole entire World Hunger class, DTN 345 World Hunger, that if you enjoyed this content and you want to learn more about it and really dive deeper, highly recommend it. But I'll end today's lecture with this quote from the World Food Program. And they say, "We know how to solve the problem of hunger. Provide food in emergencies, support small farmers, give children vital nutrition, empower women and girls, and support local food markets." So I hope you've seen lots of different examples throughout the lecture of organizations that are working toward that and who certainly need qualified professionals to help support them in their work. So consider making this a part of your career and your future. I hope you enjoyed the lecture today, and we will see you next time.